Through the origins of the institution of property, a thought experiment. The bargaining model shows how cooperation can create a surplus that benefits everyone. This type of reasoning can be used to perform a thought experiment that is helpful in understanding the origins of property. Let us imagine a simplified world in which there are people, land, farm tools, and weapons, but no courts and no police. In this imaginary world, government does not vindicate and protect the rights to property asserted by the people who live on the land. Individuals, families, or alliances of families enforce property rights to the extent that they defend their land holdings. People must decide how many resources to devote to defending their property claims. Rational people allocate their limited resources so that, as we saw in Chapter 2, the marginal cost of defending land is just equal to the marginal benefit. This means that at the margin, the value of the resources used for military ends, the marginal benefit equals their value when used for productive ends such as raising crops or livestock. Marginal opportunity cost. For example, the occupants are rational if allocating a little more time to patrolling the perimeter of the property preserves as much additional wealth for the defenders as they would enjoy by allocating a little bit more time to raising crops. The same statement could be made about allocating land between crops and fortifications, or about beating metal into swords or plowshares. These facts describe a world in which farming and fighting are individually rational, but are they socially efficient? In Chapter 2, we offered the following definition of inefficient production. The same or fewer inputs could be used to produce a greater or same total output. Can some mechanism be found that uses fewer resources to achieve the same level of protection for property claims? One possible mechanism is law. Suppose that the costs of operating the system of property rights are less than the sum of all individual costs of private defense. Such a mechanism would allow the transfer of resources from fighting to farming. For example, the landowners might create a government to protect their property rights at lower cost in individual taxes than each individual spends on fighting. The savings might come from economies of scale and having one large army in the society to defend everyone, rather than many small, privately financed armies. Superscript 6, which reads, recall that economies of scale occur when the cost per unit or average cost of production declines as the total amount of output increases. A production technology for which the unit costs are falling at every level of production, even very large levels, is called a natural monopoly because one producer can sell at a lower price than many smaller producers. In other words, there may be a natural monopoly on force. We could imagine the parties bargaining together over the terms for establishing a government to recognize and enforce their property rights. They are motivated by the realization that there are economies of scale in protecting property by reaching an agreement to have one government backed by one army. Everyone can enjoy greater wealth and security. The bargain eventually reached by such negotiations is called the social contract by philosophers because it establishes the basic terms for social life. Superscript 7, which reads, the social contract has usually been thought of as a logical construct, but some theorists have used it to explain history. For example, it has been argued that feudalism in the Middle Ages corresponds roughly to the conditions of our imaginary world. The economic factors that caused the system to be replaced in some parts of Western Europe by a system of private property rights enforced by a central government are discussed in Douglas C. North and Robert Paul Thomas' The Rise of the Western World, 1973. It would be rational for the parties negotiating the social contract to take account of other rights of owners beside the right to exclude. Many of the rights that are currently in the bundle called property could be considered, such as the right to use, transfer, and transform. Indeed, many rights other than property rights could be a part of the social contract, such as freedom of speech and freedom of religion, but they do not concern us in this chapter. The same bargaining model used to explain the sale of a second-hand car can be applied to this thought experiment, in which a primitive society develops a system of property rights. First, a description is given of what people would do in the absence of civil government, when military strength alone established ownership claims. That situation, called the state of nature, corresponds to the threat values of the non-cooperative solution, which prevails if the parties cannot agree. Second, a description is given of the advantages of creating a government to recognize and enforce property rights. Civil society, in which such a government exists, corresponds to the game's cooperative solution, which prevails if parties can agree. The social surplus, defined as the difference between the total amount spent defending land in the state of nature and the total cost of operating a property rights system in society, corresponds to the cooperative surplus in the game. Third, an agreement describes the methods for distributing the advantages from cooperation. In the car example, this agreement arises from the price that the buyer offers and the seller accepts. In the thought experiment, this agreement arises from the social contract that includes the fundamental laws of property. To see the parallel more clearly, imagine that our world consists of only two people, A and B. In a state of nature, each one grows some corn, steals corn from the other party, and defends against theft. Each of the parties has different levels of skill at farming, stealing, and defending. Their payoffs in a state of nature are summarized in Table 4.1. Taken together, A and B produce 200 units of corn. But it gets reallocated by theft. For example, A steals 40 units of corn from B and loses 10 units of corn to B through theft. Notice that A ultimately enjoys 80 units of corn. And B enjoys 120 units after taking into account the gains and losses from theft. Instead of persisting in a state of nature, A and B decide to enter a cooperative agreement, recognize each other's property rights, and adopt an enforcement mechanism that puts an end to theft. Let us assume that cooperation will enable them to devote more resources to farming and fewer resources to fighting, so that total production will rise from 200 units to 300 units. 100 units thus constitutes the social or cooperative surplus. In civil society, there will be a mechanism for distributing the surplus from cooperation, such as government taxes and subsidies. The parties must decide through bargaining how this is to be done. A reasonable division of that surplus gives each party an equal share. So, in civil society, each party receives half of the cooperative surplus plus the individual net consumption in the state of nature, which is each party's threat value. These facts are summarized in Table 4.2. What is the meaning of this thought experiment concerning the origins of property? Read literally, you might conclude that individuals or tribes acquire government by meeting together and agreeing to create a system of law, including property rights. This literal reading is bad history and bad anthropology. Instead of a contract, a system of property law can begin with a military conquest, a rebellion against feudalism, or the disintegration of communism. Instead of history, the thought experiment is really about process that go on all the time. In a changing society, new forms of property arise continually. To illustrate property law for underground gas and the electromagnetic spectrum, radio, and television broadcasting developed in the United States during the last century, and property law for computer software, music, video, and other material on the internet, and genetically engineered forms of life developed in the last several decades. The need for a new form of property law arises in situations corresponding to our thought experiment. For example, like corn, digital music can be stolen. Without effective property law, people invest a lot of resources in stealing that music or trying to prevent its theft. These efforts redistribute music rather than invent it or manufacture it. And then now the United States has property law that prevents the stealing of digital music. The imposition of these laws may have greatly stimulated the production of music. So our thought experiment is really a parable about the incentive structure that motivates societies to continually create property. The first question that we posed about property law is, how are property rights established? This is a question about how an owner acquires the legal right to property. Our thought experiment answers the question. Why are ownership rights established? This is a question about why a society creates property as a legal right. The two questions are closely connected. Societies create property as a legal right to encourage production, discourage theft, and reduce the cost of protecting goods. Law describe Law prescribes various ways that someone can acquire a property right, such as by finding and purchasing land with natural gas beneath it, inventing a computer program, or discovering sunken treasure. Now we turn to the elaboration of how bargaining theory can help the law prescribe ways for the acquisition of property that also encourage production or discourage theft and reduce the cost of protecting goods. Question 4.2. Is the cooperative solution fair? Can the resulting inequality in civil society be justified? To answer these questions, draw on your intuitive ideas of fairness, or better still, a concept of fairness developed by a major philosopher such as Hobbes, Locke, Rawls, or Aristotle. B. Suppose that the bargaining process did not allow destructive threats, such as the threat to steal. How might this restriction affect the distribution of surplus? C. What is the difference between the principle to each according his threat value and this principle to each according to his productivity?